各位大家好，我是高良英哈，我是即马Ⅴ-part美国的总会会长。我今日的任务吼是要介绍谭胜阁给恁，但是我要介绍以前，我先甲你讲一个代志。咱昨暗时台北10点的时间，伫美国吼有一个叫做台湾关系法的听证会吼。即中间有足侪咱的足好的议员来替咱台湾讲话吼。你知影咱台湾的国际局势愈来愈歹吼，拄啊，迄个苏主席甲黄主席拢有讲过。但是咱美国国会内底的支持足强的，当然美国政府无足支持咱吼，现在，但是咱就尽量要甲用国会力量，甲美国政府施压吼。这昨有几句，这个议员讲几项代志吼，我互恁小知影者。第一就是讲，因叫美国政府继续维护台湾 F-16的飞行机啊吼，因最近国防部讲无要甲台湾这 F-16升级，所以即个有美国的国会议员足担心的，所以足侪议员讲即个代志。第二就是讲，因希望讲陈水扁总统会当互保外就医吼，包括Representative夏波甲即个 Sherman， 伊拢讲足大声，伊讲陈总统身体无好。应该会放这是甲即个台湾关系法有人权条款的一个关系吼。因感觉讲，陈总统已经无迄落人权的按照即个人权的条件来处理啊，所以应该甲合保外就医。第三个代志，这是较特别的，就是讲，阮 New Jersey 迄个代表Chris Smith， 伊讲美国政府应该放弃即个一中政策，即摆要开始建立一中一台政策，所以这个是，这是阮的一直咧杀的代志啊！希望讲咱短期内会来看到有新的种一中一台政策哈。这个 Mr. Tasek 谭胜阁哦，是咱台湾人的好朋友。伊虽然有踮咧台北大家吼，伊住几年啊，所以伊对台湾足熟，足爱台湾的。伊去哈佛读书，搁去Georgetown University 读书。伊到尾踮咧美国的外交部做25年的工课，其中有20年是咧研究台湾，甲中国，甲一个亚洲国家的关系。伊对台湾足关心的。我若逐工看我的email， 伊拢伊差不多拢有10个 email 咧讲台湾的代志，讲台湾安怎，台湾安怎做。所以伊即个是比咱台湾人更加关心台湾的美国人吼，所以咱甲鼓励者 ，Thank you， 讲。他今天要讲的题目就是说台湾要怎么样来保持台湾的主权，要怎么样走出这个新的一条道路咱就用最热烈的掌声来欢迎唐胜阁先生。We are going to have your speech on the screen in Mandarin.
我真的很荣幸，受到你们的邀请，最荣幸的是，有2位院长，有2位院长，前行政院长、现考试院长，都来给我面子，我很荣幸，我不知道怎么表示我的意思。也有张富美女士，黄坤辉主席，周庆瑜女士，我很感动，非常谢谢您的邀请。首先我也要remind people，我们损失了一个非常重要的人士， 蔡同荣是我的一个朋友，蔡同荣是一个台湾运动的一个非常有活力、非常有承诺的一个人士，他逝世了，我觉得很难过，而且我不知道你们怎么样会代替他的活力，他的智慧蔡同荣是他的名字his nickname， 他的 nickname 就是蔡公头我觉得这是 well anyway 我很对不起我的中国话，我的华语比较 rusty 但是我again 我非常感动我不知道怎么表示才好，我很抱歉，我从这一点起我用英语讲。My speech, of course, is about Taiwan's future and strategies for ultimate sovereignty. I think about 9 years ago, in December of 2005, when I was promoting my Chinese language edition of my book, Rethinking One China here in Taiwan. Thank you. I asked the audience a question. What kind of Taiwan do you want to see in the 21st century? Did you want a Taiwan that would continue to remain an outstanding example of freedom and democracy in Asia? And if so, would you take responsibility for your own defenses? Would you take responsibility for your own international affairs? Or perhaps the time would come under Chinese pressures, or perhaps because Taiwan businesses were too invested in China. Or maybe the people of Taiwan, out of a sheer frustration with lack of enthusiastic support from other countries, perhaps they would just be content to see Taiwan become just another special administrative region like Hong Kong or Macau, only bigger. Well, let me tell you a hopeful story from about 43 years ago when Taiwan perhaps was faced with its greatest crisis of sovereignty. It was the expulsion of the nationalist government representative from the United Nations in October 1971. About a month after that expulsion, it was Friday, November 26, 1971, here in Taipei. I did some research on it, and I read the newspapers, the China Times, the United Daily News. It was a drizzly day. It was chilly, according to the newspaper's weather reports. It was the day after American Thanksgiving, and the American embassy, most of the people there had the day off, but the American ambassador, Walter McConaughey, was at home that morning. He received an urgent telephone call from Chiang Kai-shek's Vice Foreign Minister, Yang Shi-kun. Vice Minister Yang pleaded for an urgent confidential meeting with the ambassador, with the American ambassador. To make a long story short, Minister Yang was seeking American support for an independent Taiwan. Now, Minister Yang was a senior member of the Kuomintang Party. But he explained that Taiwan could not survive as a legitimate international entity if Taiwan continued to claim to be the government of all China and the representative of all of China's peoples in world affairs. According to Ambassador McConaughey's report of the conversation, Minister Yang described a proposal for a declaration of Taiwan independence. The declaration, Minister Yang said, should prescribe a new designation for the government. Perhaps he would call it the the Chinese Republic of Taiwan. But it would be stipulated, Minister Yang explained, that the term Chinese did not have any political connotation, but was merely used as a generic term stemming from the ethnic Chinese origin of the populace on Taiwan. It would be used in a way similar to the manner in which various Arab states use the term Arab in their official titles. Yang said that President Chiang Kai-shek would use his emergency powers to set aside the Constitution. He would dissolve all of the parliamentary type bodies, including the National Assembly, the Legislative Yuan, the Control Yuan, etc. President Chiang would then set up a new unicameral provisional representative body to be composed of 2/3 Taiwanese and 1/3 recent arrivals from mainland China. The new cabinet would be formed with some Taiwanese and some younger men included. And Minister Yang here explained, and I'm quoting, this is a direct quote from Minister Yang, a new image was needed to be created with the government freed of the outworn trappings, encumbrances, and shibboleths of the Kuomintang party and the establishment. Yang said that the emergency decree of the president would provide for an island-wide referendum with universal suffrage to determine the future status of Taiwan and to provide for a popularly elected representative body. At the time, this is in 1971, this is not that far-fetched an idea. Yang Shih-kun said Chiang Kai-shek himself was, quote, impressively open-minded and willing to listen. But he told the American ambassador that Chiang Kai-shek could not move without the application of a powerful persuasive force by the U.S. government. Minister Yang explained that in the summer of 1971, former Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, and Prime Minister Kishi, of course, is the grandfather of Japan's current Prime Minister, Abe Shinzo, that Kishi bluntly advised Chiang Kai-shek the only hope for the future of the Republic of China was to adopt a course of separation, giving up all mainland claims and pretensions. But of course, back in Washington, D.C., Minister Yang's plea went unanswered. President Nixon and his advisor, Henry Kissinger, were planning Nixon's visit to Peking, and Taiwan independence would disrupt their plans in ways that were too complicated to address and too unpredictable in their outcome. But imagine if Minister Yang's plan for Taiwan independence had been proposed a year earlier, it would have had enthusiastic support in Washington. But like so much of history, if one thing had happened, another thing would not have happened. And the catch-22 for a Chinese Republic of Taiwan was that President Chiang Kai-shek in Taipei would only accept it if he'd actually been expelled from the United Nations. But once he was expelled from the United Nations, China would see to it that Taiwan was never going to get back in. Well, will Taiwan ever get that chance again? History has strange ways of making sharp turns. I have to say that 20 years before 1971, in May of 1950, President Truman had gotten a letter from Chiang Kai-shek. The Americans were going to abandon Taiwan to the communist armies. Chiang Kai-shek sent a letter to President Truman offering to resign if one thing could happen. There's a transcript of the remarks President Truman made during a meeting of the National Security Council right after the beginning of the Korean War. This is a quote. The president had a letter from the Generalissimo about a month ago to the effect that the Generalissimo would step out of the situation if that would help. He said it was a private letter. He said he had kept it secret. But he said we might want to proceed along those lines in order to get the Chinese forces on Taiwan helping us. President Truman also said during the meeting that he thought the Generalissimo would step down if General MacArthur were put in. Well, at any rate, we all know what happened. The war broke out in June 26, 1950, and the Generalissimo's offer was forgotten and withdrawn. But the entire world has changed dramatically since 1950. It has changed even more dramatically since 1971, when Foreign Minister Deputy Yang Shih-kun offered a declaration of Taiwan independence. And Taiwan's freedom of movement since then has greatly narrowed. Now, this has been due largely to actions Taiwan's political, military, and business leaders themselves have taken. Taiwan's political leaders have committed Taiwan to a one China doctrine known as the 1992 Consensus. Taiwan's military leaders have acquiesced in the beginning of Taiwan's defenses, acquiesced in the weakening of Taiwan's defenses, in large part because Taiwan's political leadership is confused about the identity of the country it is pledged to defend. And Taiwan's business leaders have ensured that Taiwan is now almost entirely integrated into China's economy. Now, some academics may see parallels in the current crisis in Ukraine with Taiwan's own situation. But at least Russia theoretically recognizes Ukraine's independence, even if a substantial part of Ukraine's voters still want unification with Russia. But that gets back to the original question. What kind of country do Taiwan's people want to have in the 21st century? I think 4 years ago, I had the privilege of addressing the World Taiwan Conference about Taiwan sovereignty. And I have to admit that I did not think that I would be back here in Taipei able to talk about it 4 years later. I am by nature pessimistic. And I have long been in the habit of making wagers that bad things will happen. On November 12th, 2012, for example, I received a case of very expensive Napa Valley Cabernet via UPS delivery right to my doorstep from my brother. He is a Democrat. I am a Republican, and I had bet him a case of wine that Obama would be reelected. My brother was very happy. He was very happy that Obama was reelected, that he had lost the bet, and he was sending me the wine in hopes that it would comfort me in my sadness. Well, I say this because that is just sort of one of the things I do. When people argue with me about what's going to happen in the future, I say, are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? I'll bet you that this is going to happen. On September 17th in 2008, in a conference in Tokyo, I made another bet. I bet this 10,000 yen note that by the end of President Ma Ying-jeou's first term, Taiwan would no longer be in a position to assert its sovereignty against China. I predicted that Taiwan would sever its security ties with the United States and that it would become part of the area of China's security responsibilities. No longer would America have to worry about Taiwan's defense. That would change over to China. I reasoned that President Ma had always been a very strong advocate of one China and a very strong opponent of Taiwan's independence. I recall that in his first foreign policy crisis just a few months earlier, in June of 2008, it was to challenge Japan over the Senkaku Islands. I thought, why choose that as your first crisis? I mean, there are lots of things that Taiwan has to deal with. Why get involved in that? That crisis immediately signaled to me that President Ma intended over time to disengage Taiwan from its network of friendly relations with Asia's democracies and from its security relationship with the United States, and that President Ma hoped to move Taiwan into a security relationship with China instead. Now, I also predicted that President Ma's policies of closer economic ties with China would foreclose any chance of Taiwan by placing Taiwan's economy and its banking in China's total control, with more and more Taiwan industry and Taiwan manufacturing moving to China, with Taiwan's trade dependence on China leaving the new Taiwan dollar a subcurrency of China's renminbi, and with a hollowing out of Taiwan's economy, and with more and more Chinese workers, migrants, and professionals quietly taking over Taiwan services sectors. I saw little chance that Taiwan would ever be in a position to resist China's rapid takeover of Taiwan. I argued that China and Taiwan would enter into a new era of the third Kuomintang共产党cooperation. And I think that I did have a picture here. The Kuomintang and the共产党are the main opponents in China's civil war 65 years ago. That the two parties, Kuokong Liangdang, would not they were the arbiters of Taiwan's future and would not permit Taiwan's people to decide their future. These were the two warring parties in mainland China's civil war 65 years ago. So whenever you hear the Chinese talk about 对等的待遇, 对等的谈判, they're not talking about a sovereign Taiwan and a sovereign China. They're talking about the two parties. Now, this is in September 17th, 2008 that I made this bet of 10,000 yen. And several other conferees at that meeting, including a senior Japanese diplomat that some of us may know, Ambassador Okazaki. He took me up. He said, no, this can't happen. I will bet you 10,000 that does not happen by the end of Ma Ying-jeou's first term. He could not possibly move in that direction. Ma Ying-jeou, they said, would only do the bare minimum to keep China happy, but he would never jeopardize Taiwan's security, its economy, or its sovereignty. Now, of course, that was 6 years ago, and I'm happy to report that I had lost the bet as of May 20th, 2012. Today, in March 2014, I am less happy. The Taiwan government does seem to be moving closer to a political accommodation with Beijing as we speak. As I look at the Fu-Mao, the Fu-Mao Xie, I'm not able to go through it all 187 pages, but it strikes me that what I'd looked at, there doesn't seem to be anything in it that's good for Taiwan. Not a thing that would move Taiwan into a better position. Not a thing at all. And I think, well, what is the purpose of this?
Maybe I need to translate.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
伊讲伊看迄个服贸协议的160几条的协议，伊无法度一条一条读，但是伊感觉内底无一条是对台湾好的。
But and I think we have a panel later on where we can discuss this in greater length.
咱下头有一个 panel 吼，有一寡人来谈。小等倒来有要去讨论这个代志。
But I think I'm even perhaps not as hopeful now about Taiwan's future as I was even in September 2008. Still, I do think there is a way for Taiwan to reverse the trend of absorption by China. It will require strategic changes in the policy of the Taipei government, however. And those changes come in 4 major areas. They have to be economic changes in direction, changes in the national defense, changes in the direction of Taiwan's diplomacy, and of course, changes in the direction of Taiwan's political structure, including its legal and constitutional structures. And these changes in strategy have to be undertaken in a way that will not draw a catastrophic reaction from China or generate counter-pressures from Taiwan's most important allies, the United States, Japan, and the European Union. That will be a very difficult balance to make, but I think it can be done. The most urgent tasks for sovereignty, then, are to restructure Taiwan's economic dependence on China and to rebuild Taiwan's capacity to defend itself. I do not think one can move on to the other strategic changes until those basic facts are addressed. You can't sort of move on to the diplomacy and the politics until you've basically rebuilt your economy and your national defense. 4 years ago at this conference, I'm afraid I made some pretty controversial observations about the hollowing out of Taiwan's economy as it was being absorbed ever more deeply by China. I suggested that Taiwan could not survive many more years if it proceeded along a path of economic integration with China. My concerns caught the attention of the government, of course, because I worried that the implementation of the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement with China would harm Taiwan's economy by hollowing it out. The terms of the ECFA would encourage Taiwan manufacturing to relocate its production in China. And proposals to open Taiwan's financial sector to Chinese banks and to open Taiwan's services markets, right down to the retail level, to the street level, to Chinese companies, would lead to unbelievable competition that would worsen the effects of Taiwan's economic absorption by China. Now, since then, Taiwan's economic growth has dropped from 13% in the year the ECFA was signed to 8% the next year, and then, of course, to 1% in 2012 and 2.5% last year. This is all despite the government's estimate that 2013 growth would be 3.6%. It missed that by a third. Taiwan's exports have remained stagnant, and even exports to China. Supposedly, the ECFA was going to increase exports to China. Even exports to China have been dropping. And what does that mean for Taiwan? It means, to me, it's an indication that factories in China have now taken over production of the components they used to import from Taiwan. In 2009, Taiwan was America's 9th largest trading partner, with two-way trade at $46 billion. Taiwan was the United States' 6th largest agricultural market. But you know, U.S. two-way trade has fallen with Taiwan for several years. It was $50 billion in 2008. It was $64 billion in 2007. Now, I must admit, however, that two-way trade with the United States has dropped precipitously for everybody, 15 to 20% a year since Ma Ying-jeou's election as Taiwan's president. But in fact, in 2009, Taiwan exports to the United States only totaled $28 billion, which was the lowest level since 1994. Taiwan's 2009 exports to the United States were less than 2/3 of the level from 2000 when Lee Teng-hui was in office. The global downturn in economics has certainly caused some of this, but for the past decade, Taiwan has shifted from direct exports to the United States to indirect exports to processing assembly lines in China, and from there, Taiwan goods go to the United States. In the past few years, a significant portion of Taiwan's factories have stopped producing altogether. They have closed down, and many Taiwan businesses now do their primary production in China. In fact, the latest figures I have show that 52% of Taiwan's manufacturing orders are filled with offshore production. For information technology products, however, this number goes from about a half to almost 90%. 90% of Taiwan's product orders are filled, information technology product orders are filled by Taiwan factories in China. 5.3% are built by Taiwan factories elsewhere overseas, and 4.9% are manufactured in Taiwan. Now, I am not sure how Taiwan can pull out of this spiral into economic stagnation without a serious pushback from Taiwan's voters. Surely there is a common desire among voters, at least for those voters who have jobs in Taiwan, as opposed to those who've gone to China to find jobs. There must be a common desire among the voters to protest the hollowing out of their industries and to protest new employment pressures in every sector, including agriculture, services, finance, education, and retail, as well as manufacturing. Unless Taiwan can regain some control over its economic stagnation that has resulted from the ECFA and the unrestrained drainage of its manufacturing base to China, it will have little choice over the next 10 years but to resign itself to a fate as just another special administrative region of China. Now let me move on to national defense. Taiwan has already allowed its defenses to atrophy. In the 1980s, Taiwan's defense expenditures were over 20% of GDP. In the 1990s, they had dropped to 5%, but was still robust, and then to 2.8% in the early 2000s. The Legislative Yuan cut defense spending to 2.4% in 2005, rose again in 2008, but since 2008, defense spending has dropped to 1.8% of GDP. This is one of the lowest levels of defense spending in East Asia. Military manpower was cut from 275,000 in 2008 to 235,000 today, and it will go down to 175,000 by the end of the year. Except that this year's budget, the plan is for 175,000, but it seems that this year's budget in Taiwan can only support 159,000. The time of military service for Japanese is cut to less than a year, and conscription, in fact, is being abolished altogether. Last year, a U.S. Congressional Research Service report describes concerns that Taiwan's military was being hollowed out. I think these figures make it clear that Taiwan's political leadership does not take seriously the defense of Taiwan. But I don't know why that is. A credible national economy and a credible national defense, though, are two prerequisites to maintaining Taiwan's sovereignty for itself, other than, as opposed to giving over sovereignty to China. Therefore, to secure Taiwan's sovereignty, the political debate in Taiwan really has to address these two questions as urgent. The political debate should focus on the economy, should focus on defenses. The other issues, I think we have to wait and get the first building blocks put together. The next two strategies for Taiwan's sovereignty aren't really possible unless the economy and defense are secure. But let's assume that Taiwan's democratically elected representatives can rebuild the country's economy and defenses. How then could they proceed to preserve Taiwan's sovereignty? I think we have to agree, and I think Yang Shih-kun in 1971 agreed that Taiwan is a sovereign nation already. The most important element in cementing Taiwan's future is for the people of Taiwan to elect leaders who are committed to their future. I think just this past month, there has been much talk about the first meeting of the representatives of the Chinese nationalist government with the representatives of the Chinese Communist government in Nanking. All of the newspapers said, oh, this is the first such meeting since 1946. But it makes me wonder, do Taiwan's leaders still think the Chinese Civil War continues? If so, how do they think the Chinese Civil War will end? If they consider a peace agreement with Beijing, what do they imagine the terms of the peace agreement might be? It has been dispiriting to watch Taiwan's economy become ever more enmeshed with China's for the past decade, and to watch Taiwan's defenses hollowed out just as badly as its economy. I don't think these were things that President Chen Shui-bian wanted to see happen, but he seemed uncertain how to halt Taiwan's economic marginalization within the greater Chinese economic co-prosperity sphere. And certainly, the United States government applauded closer economic ties between Taiwan and China, even as it severely pressured President Chen Shui-bian on his resistance to Taiwan's demands for political submission. Today, however, I believe Washington sees Taiwan's relationships with China as fraught with problems. But presuming Taiwan can halt and reverse its economic dependence on China and its weakened defenses, unless and until Taiwan is constitutionally and politically unified with China, I think the international community accepts, and I think most nations even support, China's autonomous international personality. As I reminded this audience in March of 2010, the US State Department did not want to allow a Chinese claim to sovereignty over Taiwan to gain acceptance in the international community, particularly in the United Nations. In the summer of 2007, US diplomats made a confidential protest to the United Nations Secretariat saying, quote, "The United States has become aware that the UN has promulgated documents asserting that the United Nations considers, quote, Taiwan for all purposes to be an integral part of the PRC, end quote. While this assertion is consistent with the Chinese position, it is not universally held by United Nations member states, including the United States." Now, moreover, the United States delegation warned that if the UN Secretariat insists on describing Taiwan as part of the PRC, or on using nomenclature for Taiwan that implies such status, the United States will be obliged to disassociate itself on a national basis from such a position. Now, I have been told directly by diplomats from 4 other countries, from Japan, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, that it is indeed still their respective government's policy on Taiwan not to recognize Chinese sovereignty. They'll pay lip service to it, they'll acknowledge that China has this position, but their policy is not to recognize sovereignty. And I have to say, with the help of WikiLeaks, the revelation is true, that in August of 2007, and I think Ambassador Luo Fuchen, yes, Luo Fuchen actually read this telegram. The United Nations Secretary General confirmed that he would not use that language anymore.
So, 2007年这个 WikiLeaks 有一个消息，就是讲联合国的迄个主席，确实讲伊后摆袂阁用这个名词，就是讲台湾是中国的一部分。
Now, America's new strategy in Asia, it is the so-called pivot to the Pacific, is a further recognition in Washington that China is the real challenge to peace in the Asia-Pacific region. I believe that there is a new sympathy in Washington for Taiwan's precarious position. I also believe that the matter of a formal declaration of independence by Taiwan is something that must be held in abeyance until Taiwan's economy and national defenses are rebuilt and consolidated. Until then, Taiwan's political leadership, from President Ma and the Chinese Nationalist Party on Taiwan to the Democratic Progressive Party, the Taiwan Solidarity Union, and other political parties, I think they must insist that Taiwan's sovereignty belongs to the Taiwan people. The World Taiwan Congress must play a role in educating Taiwan's own citizens about the international realities of Taiwan's sovereignty, and a role in reminding them that international support for Taiwan's sovereignty can only come if Taiwan's own citizens are committed to their country's economic rebuilding, its defense strength, and its democratic future. Now, this is not just a problem for Taiwan. We have seen similar tensions exist in Ukraine, for instance. For example, their increasing pressures from an authoritarian Russia have given new strength to pro-Russian forces inside Ukraine's electorate. Russia seeks to bring Ukraine back into the Russian fold in ways not exactly identical, but similar in ways to China, to the ways China wants to bring Taiwan back into China's embrace. I think historically in the 1930s, Austria and then Czechoslovakia, the world saw how pressures from a totalitarian Germany for a, quote, unified German nation eradicated democracy in those countries. So Taiwan's predicament is not unique to Taiwan. But Taiwan cannot walk before it can crawl. The WCT's primary mission in 2014 then must be to help Taiwan crawl out of its current weaknesses without drawing a backlash from China and without alienating sympathetic nations who wish Taiwan well. And who knows? History has an odd way of making sharp twists, and Taiwan's people must be prepared for anything that can preserve their sovereignty. Now, I will end, I'm afraid, on a pessimistic note. You remember the 2,000 yen wager that I made in 2008, that by the end of President Ma's term, Taiwan would have lost all chance of staying outside of China's security responsibility. Well, I emailed my friends with whom I had the bet, and they all replied that, okay, you had made your point. Perhaps we should wait until the end of President Ma's second term to decide who really won. I really sincerely hope I lose. Thank you very much.